Birmingham, Alabama, November 1956. Nat King Cole was staying at a hotel where a sign above the lobby piano read, "For white guests only." The same hotel had just hosted him as their most prestigious guest because he was famous. The same city had just paid him thousands of dollars to perform because he was talented. But the piano, the instrument Nat had played since he was 4 years old, the instrument that made him who he was forbidden to him because of the color of his skin. At 3 a.m., when the lobby was empty and silent, Nat sat down at that piano anyway. He didn't ask permission, didn't apologize. He just played. And the white hotel guest who found him there did something nobody expected, something that would stay secret for 40 years because both men knew the danger of what had just happened. Before I share this incredible story with you, if you want to discover the most touching moments from the golden era of entertainment, real stories of humanity, and the unknown sides of legends from the 1950s through 1980s, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the story I'm going to tell you today isn't just about a piano or a singer. It's about dignity, courage, and two men who chose humanity over hatred in a time and place where that choice could cost them everything. Nathaniel Adams Coles, known to the world as Nat King Cole, was born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1919. His father was a Baptist minister. His mother played piano and organ at their church. Music wasn't just entertainment in the Cole household. It was worship. It was expression. It was survival. By age 4, Nat could play hymns on the church piano. By 12, he was leading the church choir. By 15, he dropped out of school to pursue music full-time. Nat moved to Los Angeles in 1937 and formed the King Cole Trio. His piano playing was revolutionary, smooth, sophisticated, jazz-inflected, but accessible. His voice was even more remarkable, warm, intimate, like velvet wrapped around every word. By the late 1940s, Nat King Cole was one of the most popular musicians in America. His song Mona Lisa topped the charts in 1950. Unforgettable became a standard in 1951. By 1956, Nat was selling millions of records, performing to sold-out crowds, and earning more money than most white musicians could dream of. But none of that mattered in Birmingham, Alabama, because in 1956, Birmingham was the most segregated city in America. Jim Crow laws were strictly enforced. Black people and white people used separate water fountains, separate bathrooms, separate restaurants. Black musicians could perform for white audiences, but they couldn't sit in the same section, couldn't eat in the same dining rooms, couldn't stay in the same hotels, unless the hotel specifically catered to black guests, which most didn't. When Nat toured the South, he faced this reality constantly. Cities that paid him thousands of dollars to perform wouldn't let him eat in their restaurants or stay in their best hotels. It was humiliating, degrading. But Nat endured it because he believed music could transcend hatred. He believed that if he kept performing, kept being excellent, kept showing white audiences that a black man could be sophisticated and talented and worthy of respect, eventually things would change. But belief doesn't make injustice hurt less. And in November 1956, that pain reached a breaking point. Nat was scheduled to perform at the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium on November 3, 1956. It was part of his Southern tour, a series of concerts through Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. The Birmingham show was sold out. 2,000 seats, all of them filled with white audience members. Black attendees were relegated to a small balcony section in the back. Nat arrived in Birmingham the day before the concert. He was staying at the Redmond Hotel, one of the few upscale hotels in Birmingham that would accept black guests, though with heavy restrictions. Black guests could rent rooms, but they couldn't use the main dining room, couldn't use the swimming pool, and couldn't use the grand piano in the lobby. That piano was a beautiful instrument, a 1920s Steinway grand, polished mahogany, sitting under a crystal chandelier in the center of the lobby. Above the piano, a small brass plaque read, "For white guests only." Hotel management had installed the sign to make it clear that while black guests were tolerated in the building, they were not welcome to use the hotel's finer amenities. Nat saw that sign when he checked in. He stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. Then he walked to the elevator without saying a word. His manager, who was traveling with him, later said Nat was silent the entire ride up to his room, just staring straight ahead, processing the insult. The concert the next night was professional and flawless. Nat performed for 90 minutes. He sang Mona Lisa, Too Young, Nature Boy, all his hits. The white audience applauded enthusiastically. They loved him. They screamed for encores. But when the show ended, Nat returned to the Redmont Hotel, went up to his room, and sat in silence. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to that piano in the lobby. That beautiful instrument he wasn't allowed to touch. It wasn't about the piano itself. It was what the piano represented. The idea that his talent was valuable enough to entertain white people, but his humanity wasn't valuable enough to use their piano at 2:30 a.m. Nat got out of bed. He put on his suit, always a suit, always dignified, and took the elevator down to the lobby. It was empty. The front desk clerk was reading a newspaper. A night security guard was making rounds. Otherwise, silence. Nat walked across the marble floor to the piano. He stood in front of it for a moment, looking at the brass plaque. For white guests only. Then, very deliberately, Nat sat down on the bench, adjusted his position, and placed his fingers on the keys. He began to play. The music that came from that piano was extraordinary. Nat played a slow, melancholic version of Stardust, a jazz standard he'd performed thousands of times. But this wasn't a performance. This was prayer. This was protest. This was a man pouring 50 years of pain, dignity, and defiance into 88 keys. The sound filled the empty lobby. Soft, but unmistakable. Beautiful, but heartbreaking. The front desk clerk looked up from his newspaper, startled. The security guard, a man named James, stopped walking and listened. Nat didn't look at them. He just played. His eyes were closed, his head slightly bowed, his fingers moving across the keys with the precision and grace of someone who'd been playing since childhood. This was who Nat King Cole was. Not a black man, not a white man, just a musician, a human being expressing his soul through sound. He played for maybe 5 minutes. Then he transitioned into Unforgettable, his most famous song, the one that had made him a star, the one white people loved. And as he played, something remarkable happened. A white man walked into the lobby. He was in his 50s, wearing pajamas and a robe. A guest staying on the 3rd floor. His name was Thomas Whitmore, a businessman from Chattanooga, Tennessee. He'd been awakened by the music drifting up through the hotel ventilation system. Thomas walked into the lobby and saw Nat King Cole sitting at the piano. The piano with the "For White Guests Only" sign. And Thomas stopped walking. He stood there, about 20 feet away, watching, listening. James, the security guard, tensed. This was it. This was the confrontation. In 1956 Birmingham, a black man using a whites-only facility could be arrested. The hotel could call the police. Nat could be thrown in jail. Or worse. But Thomas didn't call for the police. He didn't yell. He didn't object. He just stood there, listening to Nat play Unforgettable, and tears started running down his face. Nat finished the song. The last note hung in the air. Then, silence. Nat opened his eyes and saw Thomas standing there. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Thomas did something that shocked everyone in that lobby. He walked over to the piano. Not quickly, not aggressively, slowly, deliberately. And when he reached the piano, he sat down on the bench, next to Nat King Cole. "I play a little," Thomas said quietly. "May I?" Nat looked at him, surprised. Then he nodded. "Of course." Thomas placed his hands on the keys and began playing the bass line, "To Georgia on My Mind." A simple, repetitive pattern. Nat listened for a moment, recognizing the song. Then he joined in, playing the melody and harmonies above Thomas's bass line. The two men, one black, one white, sitting side by side on a bench in front of a piano marked "For White Guests Only," played together. They played for 20 minutes. Nobody said a word. The front desk clerk didn't move. James, the security guard, stood frozen, watching history unfold in that lobby. Because what was happening wasn't legal. In 1956 Birmingham, this was integration. This was two men defying segregation laws simply by making music together. When they finished, Thomas turned to Nat and said, "Thank you. I needed that." "So did I," Nat replied. Thomas extended his hand. Nat shook it. Then Thomas stood up, nodded respectfully, and walked back to the elevator. He never told anyone at the hotel what had happened. Never bragged. Never publicized it. Because he knew what it would mean. For himself, for Nat, for the hotel. Nat stayed at the piano for a few more minutes. Then he stood, looked at the brass plaque one more time, and walked back to the elevator. James, the security guard, caught his eye. Nat nodded slightly. James nodded back. An unspoken understanding. This never happened. Nat King Cole left Birmingham the next morning. He continued his tour. He performed in Montgomery, Jackson, Atlanta. He didn't speak about what had happened at the Redmont Hotel. Neither did Thomas Whitmore. Neither did James, the security guard. The moment stayed locked in that lobby, a secret shared by three men who understood the danger and beauty of what they'd witnessed. But secrets have a way of surfacing. In 1996, 40 years after that night, James, the security guard, was dying. He was 78 years old, living in a nursing home in Birmingham. His granddaughter, Angela, visited him regularly. And during one of those visits, James told her the story. About Nat King Cole. About the segregated piano. About the white man who sat down and played alongside him. Angela was stunned. "Grandpa, why didn't you ever tell anyone?" "Because it wasn't safe," James said simply. "Not for Mr. Cole. Not for Mr. Whitmore. Not even for me. If word had gotten out that I'd allowed a black man to use a whites-only piano, I'd have lost my job. Maybe worse. And if people had known Mr. Whitmore played music with a black man, his business in Tennessee would have been ruined." We all understood that. So we kept quiet. "But it's 1996 now," Angela said. "Things have changed. People need to know this story." James thought about it for a long time. Then he nodded. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time." Angela contacted a local historian who specialized in civil rights history. The historian tracked down hotel records, confirmed James's employment, confirmed Nat King Cole had stayed at the Redmont Hotel on November 2nd and 3rd, 1956. They tried to find Thomas Whitmore, but he'd passed away in 1983. His family confirmed he'd traveled to Birmingham in November 1956 on business and stayed at the Redmont. The story was published in a small Birmingham newspaper in 1997. Most people didn't notice. But those who did, particularly older black musicians who'd toured the South during segregation, recognized the significance immediately. Because what Nat and Thomas had done wasn't just play music together. They'd committed an act of quiet resistance. They'd proven that when you strip away the laws, the signs, the hatred, what's left is just two human beings finding connection through art. Nat King Cole died in 1965 at age 45 from lung cancer. He never spoke publicly about the night at the Redmont Hotel. Perhaps he didn't think it was important enough. Perhaps he knew it was too dangerous. Or perhaps he understood that some moments don't need publicity to matter. Thomas Whitmore returned to Chattanooga after his business trip to Birmingham. He lived a quiet life, ran his textile company, and never mentioned what had happened. But his daughter, interviewed by historians in 1998, said her father had made a strange comment once in the 1970s. They'd been listening to a Nat King Cole record, and Thomas had suddenly said, "I played piano with him once. Most beautiful music I ever made." His daughter had thought he was joking. Only after reading the newspaper story in 1997 did she understand he'd been telling the truth. James, the security guard, passed away in 1997, shortly after sharing his story. But before he died, he told Angela something else. Something he'd never forgotten. After Nat and Thomas finished playing that night, after Thomas went back to his room, James had walked over to the piano. The brass plaque was still there. "For white guests only." James had stared at it for a long time. Then he'd taken a rag from his cleaning cart and polished the piano keys, the same keys Nat and Thomas had just played together. "I wanted to preserve that moment," James told Angela, "even if nobody would ever know about it. Those keys had just been touched by two men who refused to let hatred win, and I wanted them to shine." The Redmont Hotel still stands in Birmingham, Alabama. It's been renovated, modernized, and the old segregation signs are long gone. But in the lobby, there's now a small plaque that tells the story of November 3rd, 1956. It doesn't mention names, out of respect for the family's privacy, but it acknowledges what happened. On this site, two men defied injustice through music. The original Steinway piano is gone, replaced decades ago. But the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute has a photograph of the hotel lobby from 1956, showing that piano under the chandelier. And next to the photograph, there's a quote from Nat King Cole, taken from a 1960 interview. "Music doesn't see color. Music doesn't ask where you're from or what you look like. Music just asks if you're willing to listen." Nat never knew the full impact of that night. He didn't know that James would remember it for 40 years. Didn't know that Thomas would call it the most beautiful music he'd ever made. Didn't know that his simple act of sitting at a forbidden piano would inspire a white man to sit beside him and play. But that's the power of quiet resistance. It doesn't need audiences. Doesn't need applause. It just needs courage. The courage to sit at a piano marked "For white guests only" and play anyway. The courage to join someone you've been taught to see as different and make music together. The courage to witness something beautiful and dangerous and keep it sacred by keeping it secret. This story reminds us that not all acts of resistance are loud. Not all protests are public. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen at 3 a.m. in an empty hotel lobby, when two men decide that music matters more than signs, more than laws, more than fear. Nat King Cole changed American music. His voice, his style, his grace, they broke barriers in ways that were visible and celebrated. But this story reminds us that he also broke barriers in ways nobody saw, ways that were dangerous and quiet and brave. And Thomas Whitmore, a white businessman from Tennessee, chose humanity over hatred in a moment when it would have been easier, safer, to walk away. He chose to sit down, to play music, to see Nat King Cole not as a black man breaking a rule, but as a musician sharing his gift. That's the lesson of the segregated piano. Not that music solves racism, not that individual kindness erases systemic injustice, but that in moments of connection, when we choose to see each other as human, we create something that laws can't touch, something that survives decades of silence and speaks across generations. The piano is gone. The hotel has changed. The men who were there that night have all passed away. But the music they made together, the music nobody heard but three witnesses, still echoes. Because it proved something essential, that even in the darkest times, even in the most divided places, two people can find common ground on 88 keys. And sometimes, that's where change begins. Not with speeches or laws or grand gestures, but with two men sitting side by side, making music in the dark, refusing to let hatred have the final word.